Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a good way to start this week. I say start this week because it seems like we have a new president, we have a new government coming in, and it's good to start it with unity in diversity, which is exemplified by the Ombudsman's lead in your message and in your actions today. I'm happy to see our friends from Botolan, Zambales, ang ating mga kaibigan po. Nung ako po ay mamamahayag pa more than 35 years ago, isa po sa pinakaunang lugar na napuntahan ko ay Botolan, Zambales ang ating mga kapatid na mga Aita po. At natutuwa din na po na nandito ang mga taga Mindanao at ang mga taga Cordillera, pati na rin ang ating mga ninanais na isuot dito po. I'd like to greet and thank for sharing and in our advocacy, Ombudswoman Conchita Carpio Morales, Madam Justice. Thank you for having my twin advocacies of both environment and indigenous peoples as your programs here in the Ombudsman. In fact, in the past 2 months, both here and in Tacloban recently and now, here again today, I have seen you and your very able staff and heads of agencies embracing the very important advocacies of both environment and the implementation of our laws for indigenous people and for solid waste management. Thank you, ma'am. Deputy Ombudsman Melchor Arthur Carandang, Odo Carandang, thank you for supporting us in these initiatives. And Deputy Ombudsman Mosquera, I hope that your bonding and Earth Day programs in Bantayan also went well after Tacloban. And our Deputy Ombudsman Rodolfo Elman, Deputy Ombudsman Cilil Ramos, NCIP Commissioner Norberto Navarro, I believe that you are from Batanes, yes, the province with the least number of constituents. Is it the smallest province or is it Siquijor? But I know that you have the smallest town in the country, which is Ivana. Yes, with 900 people. I went there a few years ago. And NIA Administrator Florencio Padernal. And of course, Attorney Marie Banaag, whose father and her, when they were incumbents in their town, I met long ago in my first term, and I was very happy to see her in Tacloban and know that she works with the Ombudsman now. So Marie, thank you for bringing the issue of indigenous peoples closer to the Ombudsman and at the same time bringing your programs to our more than 14 million indigenous peoples. And of course, the development partners, UNDP and the Australian Embassy. Our indigenous peoples, just like perhaps all of us, all of you there, have never failed to amaze me. Even when I was a very young journalist more than 35 years ago, we would do documentaries on their culture, on their music, on their dance, on their textiles, on their rituals. And whenever we see in the provinces the eyepiece, we see the heart and soul of the Filipino nation. We always marvel at their culture and their heritage. And our ICCs or IPs, whichever is the politically correct way of calling them, indigenous cultural communities or indigenous peoples, are very rich in traditional knowledge, covering almost all aspects of life, in agriculture, in healthcare, in forestry, in fishing, in architecture, arts, crafts, music, literature, name it, and we have it. And in fact, if you have the chance, please visit the National Museum, where we have showcased there for the past several years the arts and crafts of our indigenous people. And in fact, not many people know that in the past years, on weekends, we would bring our indigenous brothers and sisters from the provinces and showcase their arts and culture and crafts and even sell them through people who would care to visit the National Museum on weekends. And on Sundays, they would see me with my family and friends just walk in and see how our IPs from the Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao actually perform their textile, their weaving, and are able to sell out most of the crafts that they do, and hope that this continues. But despite all these efforts, we feel that there's a real need to push the understanding of our indigenous people's culture. And despite their overwhelming contribution to our culture, to our heritage, to our history, we believe that our IPs somehow remain among the most underserved, unserved, and oftentimes neglected citizens of our country, despite the fact there's more than 14 million of them. 14 million or 17 million, we're not sure of. That would depend on the PSA, on how many have actually been documented. In fact, that's one of the most recent laws that we've enacted, which is a documentation of our indigenous peoples. Because how can we preserve and conserve the culture of our IPs if we don't even know where they are? How can we provide the funding for their scholarships if we don't even know exactly where they belong or how many they are? They share a common situation with other indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. Because of historic injustices of the past, dispossession of lands and resources, and sometimes continuing discrimination, indigenous peoples are one of the sectors most adversely affected by globalization. And this phenomenon not only threatens to marginalize indigenous peoples, it threatens the very foundation of their existence and their identity. Our IPs are threatened by unsustainable extractive industries and development projects that encroach and ravage their lands without their informed consent. It was mentioned earlier, FPIC, that's very, very important and part of the IPRA law. Their way of life is also adversely affected as they are uprooted from the very soil to which they are spiritually and fundamentally linked. Despite modernization and acculturation, inevitable as this may be, we cannot turn a blind eye to these concerns because our indigenous cultural communities, along with our vast knowledge, rich culture, and traditions, are vital in solidifying the mold of every nation's identity. If we lose it, we may as well have lost who we are. As a legislator, as well in my personal capacity as an advocate of cultural preservation, we have introduced programs and converged with our agencies of government to address the concerns of our IPs. We had regional assemblies in 2012, and I'm glad that the NCIP is continuing this. And this is the National Indigenous Peoples Summit, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. This annual summit engages our indigenous peoples in policy development, implementation, and in evaluation of programs for their communities. We also have opened livelihood opportunities, especially for indigenous weaving communities, through trade fairs, partnerships with the Department of Trade and Industry and with CITEM, and we continuously showcase the indigenous knowledge systems and the practices of our ICCs through projects like the Hibla ng Lahing Filipino, which I mentioned in the National Museum, and the Dayaw TV series, which is focused on the country's preservation of our culture and heritage, which is a partnership with the National Commission on Culture and Arts, and also a Cordillera Coffee Table book, which I hope other regions with state universities and colleges would also do, because what we did was to partner with the 6 SUCs in the Cordillera, where they documented the indigenous knowledge practices in both agriculture and environment. And I'm challenging our newly appointed NCIP commissioner to please do that in Caraga, in Region 11, and many other regions of the country together with the SUCs. We continue to implement these programs and initiate many other projects to protect our IPs and to promote their heritage. But we know that there are many other concerns and more pressing needs, perhaps, we need to address for the benefit of our IPs and our ICCs. Basic services remain wanting in most geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. Our actions and our inaction have placed lives on the line, despoiled their lands, threatened their culture, and deprived them of their rights. Our eyes were open to the depth and diversity of the challenges our IPs faced. And the question is, how sincerely will we address these issues that affect our IPs' very survival? Just yesterday, in an online news, I read that it was quite difficult for some of our IPs to actually vote because hindi po nakarating sa kanila ang mga impormasyon tungkol sa mga nasyonal at mga lokal na kandidato, to deprive them of that basic information of knowing who the elective leaders are would be an injustice to them. So I'm glad that there were news that our COMELEC tried to even bring the machines to them so that they could vote in those areas. But that could be just a model area, but it should be an outreach in all other areas. And so this program that you're doing to bring this outreach program to all our indigenous peoples is really deemed very important. And the challenge here is that in order to safeguard our indigenous communities and our heritage, we must refrain from extracting our IPs from the communities they live in. Otherwise, we expose them to influences which could alter the very tradition we aim to preserve. We should not take them out of their community. Rather, we should bring services to their communities. To address this, we have proposed the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Resource Center, which shall serve as access centers to enhance the delivery of basic social, technical, and even legal services. Centers shall be composed of the following service areas. First, statistical service area, which is covered by the PSA under a previous law which we authored, the Human Development Index service area, and the Domains Management service area. These centers will help address problems of our indigenous peoples and provide essential services such as employment, sustainable livelihood, enterprises, health services, scholarships, and trainings. These centers shall embark on the documentation of indigenous knowledge, systems and practices, indigenous political structures, and customary laws which are vital in achieving cultural integrity. These elements are part of my proposed measure, which I submitted to the Senate, which has been approved actually on third reading, but still awaiting the approval of the counterpart measure in the lower house. But last February, even before it was enacted into law, we have already inaugurated the country's first ever Indigenous Peoples Resource Center, housed at the UP Visayas. The Center for West Visayan Studies had hosted the first IP center in our country. I hope that our other SUCs in other provinces and regions will host an IP resource center as well, even without the legislation yet. I would challenge again our commissioner here in the NCIP, napakaraming hamon binibigay ko sa iyo, na sana yung ating nasimulan na IP resource center in UP Visayas can be replicated in other regions of the country. These IP resource centers can also be a venue for the Office of the Ombudsman's outreach service to our IPs to provide them with the needed information about the role of the Ombudsman and other agencies of government in granting permits for the exploration of their land, perhaps, or natural resources. So I am so pleased that the Office of the Ombudsman is reaching out to our IPs to know more about the impact of government programs in their communities. While we, in the Senate, we will also continue to work on legislation for the benefit of our indigenous peoples, to preserve your traditions, to safeguard your cultural property rights, to guarantee equal opportunities, and to prohibit discrimination based on ethnicity, race, religion, or belief, among others. We still have a long way to go in effectively protecting the rights of our IPs, but we should not lose hope. We must continue to work together and assure the role and significance of our IPs in our country. And I am hopeful that this program of the Ombudsman will be an effective tool that will lead us to a clearer path on how we can confront the challenges and effectively build policies to protect our indigenous peoples. I hope that with this second program that we are partnering with, in a way, with the Office of the Ombudsman, both in the ecological solid waste management law and in the protection of the rights of indigenous people, we can have a greater partnership for the implementation of all our laws that protect the marginalized and the vulnerable. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you.